to 15. And we are now midway through our programme, and our exhibition curator, Nicola Baird, will remind you of our remaining 3 upcoming events at the end of tonight's one. Just a reminder, as you can see on the screen, that this evening's event is being recorded, and hence we're asking you to kindly keep your microphones muted and your cameras turned off during the talk to lessen any possible interference. If you could also keep them off, please, during the Q&A between Nicola and Martin, and then if you wish, you could turn them on at the end for the public Q&A. So the format of the event tonight is that our speaker, Martin Pickles, will very briefly introduce his film, then hand over to Nicola, who will play the film, which is about 17 minutes long. Please note that the chat function will be open tonight throughout the event, and messages will go directly to Nicola. After the film, Nicola will do a Q&A with Martin for about 15 minutes before fitting in as many of your questions as she can at the end in the available time remaining. And then she will close the event by telling us about the upcoming events that follow this one. And so without further ado, to our distinguished speaker this evening, who I'm delighted to welcome. Martin Pickles is a London-based filmmaker and animator, and he teaches animation theory at the University for the Creative Arts, Farnham. He studied classics at Oxford and animation at the Royal College of Art, and he created and curates London Animation Club, a screening event featuring international guest speakers. And so over to you, Martin. Thank you.
I was having a little difficulty unmuting myself there, my apologies. Thank you very much indeed.
So if you'd like to just briefly introduce the film, Martin?
Yes, certainly. I was friends with a man called Wolf Lenkovic, who ran a gallery called T1 and 2, and they used to squat buildings in the East End of London and put on and convert them into art galleries. And the very first one of these exhibitions that Wolf put on was at their Wheeler Street building, which is an old factory building, and it was for Gustav Metzger, and it was for this 100,000 newspapers exhibition that that was the very first one. Very briefly, Wolf knew me and knew that I'd bought a very nice new digital camera, and the setup for the exhibition would be that evening. And he phoned me with about 3 hours notice and asked me to come along and just record as documentation the events and the setup that evening. But I found that Gustav was a very gracious interviewee, so I recorded some interviews with him as well, and that's how the film came about.
Thank you so much. I'll just share my screen in a minute and begin playing the film. And just to say that Metzger was very softly spoken, and so if you'd all like to sort of increase your volume so that you can hear properly, that would be brilliant, in case there are any quiet moments. But I'll begin playing the film now.
these headings are so permanent. They would have been applicable 10, 20, 30, 40 years ago. But certainly there are areas in life where tempo is accelerating, like in the subject of extinction, where there's no question that in the past 3 or 4 decades there's been a tremendous escalation in the rates of extinction. And actually that's ongoing. And the current political military crisis is one that affects everybody. And I see that there is a certain particular sense in this exhibition in relation to what is happening and what might be happening out in those parts of the world that everybody's talking about now. But I'm not putting that in as a subject, because if I did, then within a few hours all these panels would be filled with war, and I don't think that would be interesting. And in as far as everybody's talking about this particular war, I think it's just as well that one also in this exhibition concentrates on other subjects, which actually may be more important, far more important than a bit of fighting.
Okay, well this is just called Chuck and Float. So it's an idea of Gustav's, which we do tonight. After I've thrown some metal into here, Gustav's going to slowly start filling the lower layer of this with newspapers. Tomorrow we're going to continue it. It's going to, the layer, the sea of newspapers down here is going to slowly rise. So if you feel like coming back tomorrow and seeing how the installation changes, you're welcome. Okay, Gustav?
While you do this, I'm going to stay down.
Yeah.
Well, we did nothing to that space except put in a certain amount, not a very large quantity at present, of newspapers. And that is very much in line with the way I've been working since the end of 1959, found objects. I mean, I describe this to people who come out as a found object. And a found object, there are artists who manipulate it, who paint it, who destroy it, and in my work since end of 59, I have almost always just left the found object as it is and concentrated on its inherent qualities rather than adding to it or taking anything away or disturbing it or distorting it. That's exactly my attitude to this. Leave it. It's so powerful. It's so extraordinary and so moving that once you start either tidying it up or putting all kinds of objects into it, it would only diminish the power that it has now. And certainly there's a beautiful interaction between the fragility of each piece of paper and the metallic hardness of the substructure and these jagged shapes coming up and the holes which are waiting to be filled, but which some of them will never be filled, not even tomorrow, however much time spent. They're so deep, yes, and I wouldn't try and fill deep holes. If I get a general flattish surface, tomorrow I shall be perfectly content. This started on Tuesday night, this part of the exhibition, and we had this space completely empty, this inner space empty, and I started floating, throwing, sort of rather quietly, papers, as I will do now. And then I left the room after the space after about 5-8 minutes. And when I came back, this space was filled with papers, like it is now, but much more extreme, high up almost to sort of here, sort of packed out with papers. And evidently, while I was very feeble, sort of quietly throwing individual pieces, probably through quite a lot, quite quickly. And I'm told there were at one point 6 or 7 people up here throwing. So suddenly, this was very much transformed into a kind of pile, mound of we took that out, and you see that mound now in that space, in a corner, sort of tucked away into a corner. My original idea was to try and have a kind of sea of papers from there to there, and to height, I'm pointing to that height there. And tonight I would like to try and, as it were, continue with that task of filling that area so that we end up with a kind of flat, relatively flat area. You know, for me, these are fundamental, it's fundamental material of tremendous significance. So it isn't, for me, simply a matter of creating a visual experience by a final kind of visual statement, but it's the content of whatever is in there which is, to me, of primary importance. And again, to come back to the central purpose of the exhibition, which is to invite the public to physically engage with the mass media, to look at it, cut it up, select significant elements, visual or textual, and then we will put these cuttings on panels. And eventually we hope to have perhaps 50 panels which could then form the basis of a touring exhibition across this country or others. And for example, here's a cutting which is on the board of sort of a shell-shocked building. Yeah? Well, one image out of tens of thousands, which will eventually be in that space. And that, I think, is so important. Because the content is so significant in every direction. And then if you were throwing in the Daily Star, it would be a totally different content to it. But obviously there is an aesthetic element in the throwing, in the folding, in the manipulation with air and space, which I'm sure we are all aware of, which is another integral part of it.
So yes, so what's exciting about this evening is that that was in fact the inaugural screening of the 100,000 Newspapers film, which documented Gustav Metzger's 2003 public active installation and performances of the same name. At the T1 and 2 art space in East London. And that now brings us to the discussion section of the evening. And I'm going to, I'm now going to pose Martin some questions before we open up to the audience Q&A. So Martin, I wonder if you could expand on how you came to make this film.
Yes, I was friends with Wolf. I got to know him through various art friends, and he contacted me at very short notice when he was setting up this exhibition, asked me to come over with 3 hours notice and just to document the exhibition for archive purposes. And he had an idea he might screen the result at a future exhibition, but it never happened, and the work was unedited. I decided to edit it myself a few years later because I felt it should have some kind of presence of itself, some kind of entity of itself, rather than sit there just as rushes. And Wolf had squatted this enormous building. I think it was an old factory building. It was, you only saw a small part of it, and that was just a small section of it. And yeah, I went in and I filmed the space, and I filmed Gustav at work. He was just in the background, very unassuming. I followed him around, I followed him setting up, and obviously I filmed the performances, but he was so unassuming, I just went over and started talking to him. And he was very giving, very quietly spoken, but extremely honest, very, very engaging, but remarkably modest and unassuming.
I wondered if you could just explain who Wolf is.
Well, yes, Wolf Lenkovic is the son of Robert Lenkovic, and I understand you had an exhibition of Robert's work a few years ago. I only discovered this quite a while after that, and it turns out that I'd actually met his father completely independently. Wolf was an interesting fellow. I think he came to art, to being a fine artist, comparatively late. And he would squat these empty buildings and live in them and find his furniture in the street. And then usually in the downstairs area, he would choose some rooms and paint them and turn them into exhibition spaces. He would invite guest artists, some of whom were of very high standing, to exhibit work there. And then he would throw everything open and have performances, and usually an opening party. And I got to know a lot of people that way. We'll continue to do that for a few years, but it was just a little window of time that he was doing that in.
So am I right in thinking you hadn't met Metzger before?
Never met him.
So you said a little bit about your first impressions, but I wonder if you could talk a bit more about those.
Well, he was so unassuming. He was just this little guy in the background, dressed in a very down-to-earth way. He had no airs and graces whatsoever. He had if I'm allowed to say, a slight twinkle in his eye. I got the impression he had a sense of humor, and a very understated sense of humor, but I felt that was in the work as well. And yeah, he was quite happy to chat. And in terms of the circumstances of filming him, I just bought this was before camera phones, obviously, and I bought a new camera, which Wolf had known about, and asked me to bring it along and film with it. And in those days, these small cameras were very unobtrusive. People were used to large television cameras, which were quite intimidating. And I had this tiny little camera. So I think that the fact that I wasn't sticking a huge camera in his face helped as well. I could be very, very discreet and hold the camera in the crook of my arm. And it was, it was quite an intimate conversation, but I was very impressed by how unassuming he was. He was just this little guy in the background that you might see at I don't know, at the bus stop or something.
And what was your experience of interviewing him like? I mean, what was you know, was the conversation quite spontaneous? How did you
Very spontaneous. Yeah, very spontaneous. He was quite intense and would describe in a lot of detail what he was working on at that precise moment and what his intentions were. And I was surprised. I mean, he'd never met me before. I wasn't terribly knowledgeable about his work, and yet here he was confiding in me all these fascinating bits of information.
And so did you have to do much editing of the film? Did you capture a lot more footage that you didn't include? Or?
I did. I mean, that's one of the nice things about these digital tape cameras. You could shoot a lot, and I think I shot about 2 hours worth, but there was a lot of repetition in that. I think there was a lot more documentation of the cutting up bits of paper and posting them on those panels. I think there was a lot more of that. I think I've got about 2 hours worth, which I'm happy to put online if anyone's interested, and I'm happy if anyone wants to make something with them. I'd be more than happy. But I felt I'd chosen the sort of key 17 minutes. I wanted to do something fairly tight, although parts of it are quite slow. I think it needed sort of fixing, really, to have some kind of coherence rather than just, you know, fly on the wall ongoing footage.
And so I'm curious, what were your impressions of the actual exhibition, 100,000 newspapers, and the performances that were enacted there?
I felt there was more to them than was being said. He would talk on quite an analytical, almost academic level about his thinking behind the performances, but I felt there was something much more visceral. The actual experience is rather different to that. The chuck and float one, in which Wolf throws sheets of metal in, was quite intimidating. This loud crashes of these vicious pieces of metal panels crashing into this abyss. I tried to do those shots at the end in the hole looking up, because it was easy not to get the right impression just watching it on video. It was a big drop with these kind of cliffs of shelves on either side. It was very intimidating, and then hurling all this material, some of it very brittle and banging, with these very delicate pieces of paper on top. The contrast, it was intimidating. It was and it was as though that was inherent, but he wasn't going to perhaps tell you about that. So I feel the experience of being an onlooker there was slightly different to what he was describing, but it was intentional. I'm sure it was intentional.
Yeah, because what struck me was really even with Metzger throwing the pieces of paper into the abyss there, which he was, you know, tearing pieces and strewing them into the middle there. And it's interesting because he mentions in the film the beautiful interaction between the fragility of each piece of paper and the metallic hardness. But you know, as you say, there's an interesting contrast there, because, you know, with what the viewer actually experienced, beautiful interaction versus actually quite intimidating. I also wondered how Wolf said it was Metzger's idea for him to also participate in the performance. I wonder how, you know, that came about and it wasn't just Metzger performing.
I don't know much about that. From what I saw in terms of their relationship, if I can just say a little bit about that, it felt as though, almost as though he was Wolf's elderly relative, and he was kind of looking after him a little bit. Not that he needed looking after, but there seemed to be kind of an intimacy that you might associate with grandson and grandfather. So it didn't surprise me that they did a performance together. They'd obviously planned the exhibition together, and yeah, Wolf was his right-hand man, helping him move things around and so on. So it didn't come as a surprise that they did something together. How
old was Metzger at the time, actually? You said the grandfather.
Well, he was in his 80s. Well, it was 2003. How old would that make him? it's easy to work out. But he was in his 80s. And yeah, I liked the fact that there was that kind of relationship between them. Actually, it was nice to observe. But as I say, it was my impression.
And how well attended was the exhibition and the performances? Was it kind of a cult following, or how widely was the word spread?
There was certainly a lot of people at the first performance. It was quite an event. I recognized a number of the people because there was, Wolf's wider circle, but I think a lot of other people either attended that first performance or perhaps visited during the day. I mean, there was a steady traffic. There was a steady trickle of people coming in. So particularly for that first performance, I mean, that was kind of shoulder to shoulder, really.
And how long was it on for, actually?
Well, I filmed it over 3 days, and those were the performances. So I think that was something like Friday, Saturday, Sunday. And then it was up for a while after that, but probably not more than about a week. It's hard to say. I'm not quite sure. But those are the days to visit it on. That's when the excitement was.
So sort of a happening style,
Absolutely, very, very much.
I wonder what was the significance of the space in which the exhibition and the performances were held, because I noticed that Metzger refers to the space and the whole piece in a way as a found object. So I wondered if you might say a bit more about that. I
think that's exactly right. I think to me the exhibition felt like a response to the space that he'd discovered. The possibilities afforded by it is a very unusual space with this sudden drop in the middle, and so you would enter it on a kind of a platform. I think so when you entered the room, I think the floor was quite low. You stood on a platform overlooking this drop, and then around the room there were all these, shelf upon shelf and upon shelf. Sorry, you asked me about using the room as a found object. He never restaged this exhibition as far as I know. And so I think it was very much specific to that space, with the room as found object, really. I think it was a unique response to that environment.
So you think he was kind of introduced to the space by Wolf, and then he came up with this concept and carried it out?
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah, so it's interesting because there's a link there with the end of the period that we at Ben Uri are focusing on, which is 1945 to 59, the late 50s. How do you think the exhibition and performance relates to Metzger's focus on found objects since 1959? I mean, just to carry on that thread there.
Yes, of course. I think it's in a direct line with it. I think his intentions are the same. I think it's it is in a pattern. It's in a line from work going right back to 1959, and he says as much himself. And also what followed. I mean, there were 2 exhibitions he gave in 2014, 2015, which also used newspapers. So obviously there was an interest at that point in newspapers and mass media, but in terms of the big difference was those 2 exhibitions were in conventional exhibition spaces. This one was specific, was unique to that one. So yes, I would say crucially in a line with his use of found objects going right back to 1959.
Where were those other 2 exhibitions you mentioned?
Well, I noted this down. One was called Extinction, and then of course he mentions extinction in the interview. Extinction: Visions of the Future in 2014. That was at the Serpentine. And then there's one called Mass Media Today and Yesterday, and I think that may have been at the Tate. I guess I think it would have been. I imagine it was Tate Britain. And that was a restaging of an exhibition or a continuation of an exhibition from 1972. So he didn't, as far as I know, he didn't restage that one, but I think he did 2 equivalents in the years that followed.
And did you keep up with Metzger after your filming in 2000?
Sadly not. I mean, I took an interest. I attended an event he gave with a number of people who you could see in the first night performance at Tate Britain. But I have to admit, I didn't, apart from seeing some of his work subsequently, I didn't keep up with the man himself, I'm afraid.
I noticed that Metzger stated during the film that the central purpose of the exhibition, 100,000 newspapers, is to invite the public to physically engage with the mass media, to look at it, cut it up, select significant elements, and then those were the cuttings that they were then put on panels in the space. And he said that could form the basis of another exhibition. Do you know if that happened, or?
I don't think it did. Unless, no, I'm pretty sure that didn't, not through T1 and 2 anyway. I'm not sure, that was the rather more, for me that felt rather more conceptual and less visceral than the performances and the installation next door. You can see people taking part and reading the results on the panels, but I'm not sure it was that as successful, really. The panels aren't terribly well filled up, and I was amused watching it again how the panel called Information Overload only has one clipping on it, and that must be deliberate. I think there is a sense of humor in his work, a very understated sense of humor that's latent, perhaps, but it's there. I think, and talking to him as well, there was a slight twinkle in his eye, I felt.
Yeah, I noticed a bit of a cheeky smile there after he'd been, throwing the newspaper sheets into the middle there, and he got down off that step ladder. I
also wondered, perhaps this is going off the point a little bit, he was surrounded by these much younger people, and I kind of wondered if he was perhaps slightly amused by them, maybe a little sense of, having not exactly a joke at their expense, but I think there may have been a little dynamic there.
So was this the 100,000 newspapers exhibition documented in any other way? I mean, was yours the only form of documentation of this happening?
I really don't know. I don't think Wolf kept an archive. I kept in touch with him, and I did subsequently film 2 or 3 events, but again, nothing was made of the material. So I did what I did with this. I had the material and I edited it into something. You can see a man with a bald head using another digital video camera. I think you can see a photographer. I find it hard to believe that he wouldn't have documented it in some way, but I don't know where the material is. Yeah.
What do you think Metzger would have thought about the film, being released now? Do you think he would be?
I think he would be pleased, but also perhaps a little bit amused. What the work is about, I think, partly is the transient nature of media. And these very delicate sheets of paper that we attribute so much seriousness to are crumpled up easily and will fade away and get thrown away. So to have something kind of crystallized, something that is replayable, is perhaps slightly antagonistic to his aim at the time, to do these fleeting performances then that are gone, and within a few days the studio space will be swept and cleared out and there'll be little trace of it. So I think he would be amused by it.
Though he did set quite a lot of store by documentation of his work, especially the more ephemeral.
The performances, yes. Okay, that's a very good point. I can only say how I felt at the time, really. It's perhaps he went in with his own camera at another time, or got someone in during the day. That's eminently possible. I can only describe what I saw, but yes, that's possible. It'd be interesting to find out, because I found very little information about this exhibition online, almost as though it's a forgotten one or a missed one. And even in the listing, I I think the Tate has an article about it. No, it has an article about a different one of the later ones that it staged, but he uses one photograph from that exhibition, and I could find very little reference elsewhere, descriptions or anything, just a couple of articles. So yeah, it seems to have been forgotten, sadly. I would be interested to know how much material the archive has, or yourselves have on it.
Yeah, well, I don't have anything specifically, but I'll let you know if I find something in my search.
Yeah, I meant if you come across something in your researches.
Yeah,
obviously, your exhibition, your events are confined to an earlier time in his career, so it's outside of that. But if you do find something, I'd be fascinated to see it.
But as I said, it's interesting, the relationship between this and the early work which we focus on, and this interest in found objects, because that's kind of where the two tie in.
Yes, absolutely.
And yeah, to come back to the focus on extinction, which I think you briefly mentioned, and this is also something we'll be discussing in next week's panel event, this focus on extinction. But I noticed a sign or a poster in the film which advertised a talk by Metzger titled "Hurry Up, It's Time," which I think is an adapted quote from T.S. Eliot's The Wasteland. So it was called The Wasted Land, wasn't it? That talk. I wondered if you knew anything more about that, and if you went to it, or seemed a bit of an enigmatic shot there.
Very enigmatic, but again, it's one of those little details. I thought, oh, what's this?
Yeah.
I don't think I did. I went to an event, as I said. I went to an event at Tate Britain, a talk he gave. I don't know if that was it. I suspect it wasn't. I think it was a little bit later. So I know next to nothing about it. I can't remember what the date of the post, what the date of the event was on the poster. So it's difficult for me to.
Yeah, I assume it must have been sometime in 2003, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, it might have been actually during the his exhibition, the 100,000 newspapers exhibition.
And there was just one other kind of key quote that I picked out that I thought it might be worth just reading out and discussing again. Was Metzger said about the newspapers, "For me, these are fundamental materials of tremendous significance. It's not simply about creating a visual experience, but it's the content which is of primary importance." And I wondered what you thought about that.
That to me sounds like perhaps a reference to the antagonism between the actual information, these world events. 2003, we had, that was the time of the Second Gulf War, wasn't it? I can't remember if it had started or not, but this is a time of immense upheaval, and you can see references to that, I think, in the newspapers, or he may even, actually he refers to it.
Yeah.
But at the same time, these are printed on flimsy bits of paper, almost trash in their own right. So I think he's making a point of gravity and sort of transience, or gravity or lack of materiality. Perhaps that we don't take historical events, news events, as seriously as perhaps we should. These inconsequential scraps of paper, what they describe as something fundamental, world-changing, and so on. Perhaps it's a reference to that. I'm not quite sure.
I wonder if outside the exhibition space he was, he collected newspapers in some way. I wonder, what his home looked like, whether there were stacks of 100,000 newspapers there.
I would be interested to know. I think he and Wolf must have visited some of the big newspaper publishers, and because he subsequently did something to do with it was called the First Congress of Forklift Trucks. There's a subsequent event he did, and I kind of wonder if a forklift truck was what brought the materials into the gallery, because I seem to remember there's one of those rising doors, one made of slats that you kind of winch up tall enough to let vehicles in. So I wouldn't be surprised if he'd he'd brought them in by forklift truck, and they're obviously in their thousands, but I doubt his house would have, you know, been able to contain them in enough quantity. So yeah, I suspect his house was untidy, but I don't think it would be piled up with newspapers.
What was this forklift truck thing you mentioned?
Well, this is a funny thing. I've found that Wolf took him to, or perhaps helped him stage, something called the world's first Congress of Forklift Trucks at the Truman Brewery. Something I knew nothing about, but it was one of the strange things around that time that I could imagine happening. It may be apocryphal, but I believe it's true. And it was, again, one of those funny events that's perhaps been lost with little documentation. I could only find one reference to it, so perhaps it's, you know, perhaps it never happened. It was made up, who knows.
Well, I wonder if there are any questions from the audience.
Do you mind if I just say something, an observation before we go over? I hope I'm not.
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
Something that was key to me about the experience of going there was not what Metzger described, but the experience of actually going down into the pit of that you can see at the very end. I went down there and I filmed looking upwards, and it was extremely intimidating. It felt like something very different, and I think this is where the nature of the found object comes in. It was really horrible. It felt like a cage or a rail or a truck, maybe on the back of a train. It felt like an evil train carriage, if that makes sense. It really was looking out of the abyss. It was extremely intimidating. And if you look at the film, you'll see that whilst there are huge piles of crumbled up newspaper in this abyss, if you look around the sides, there are neatly stacked lines of newspapers in the individual shelves. And there was a kind of a contrast between the two. It was, you have this very regulated space around, and then you have this kind of abyss in the middle. And there was something very visceral about that. And I noticed other people walking around and examining the space. And I think that is itself meaningful. I just want to draw attention to that, and I'd be interested to know what other people think. I'm not an expert on Metzger, I have to admit, but there was something terrifying about it that one might associate with some of his famous works from the 1960s. So I just wanted to make mention of that before we go over to questions, because I thought that was significant.
Yeah, and Metzger didn't say anything about that sort of side of things.
Not to me.
Interesting. I've seen on the chat, Sylvia Finzi said, I was at the Truman Brewery. He gave a talk from the forklift truck in the air as if it was completely normal position for giving a talk.
That's brilliant. That's the sort of understated sense of humor, the cheekiness, perhaps almost even, I don't know, having a joke at the expense of the audience. I don't know. So there we have a forklift truck. So that makes sense in the context of that other event. Sylvia, maybe I met you. I don't know.
And there's also a comment from Bob Parks who says, I saw the show, and seeing the movie, it still remains enigmatic. Like Marlovich with the cuboid, he won't do anything with the found object because it's powerful enough without having to do anything with it. I think it's to do with the integrity of the object, which Marlovich identifies in the world as objectlessness. Apart from Gustav and Marlovich, can you think of anybody else who holds the object with such integrity, particularly with the humble object, which has so much power because of this?
I can't really, not like this. I mean, I can think of obvious artists who made use of the found object, but I don't know whom to compare Metzger to, I'm afraid. I think you sound more knowledgeable about this than I do. I'd be interested to know what you think.
Well, Bob, you can always that in the chat.
I just think Leslie's.
Sorry?
I've just seen Leslie's comment. Do you mind if I read it out?
Yeah, please do.
Could he have chosen a bleak cellar due to his experience of Nazi Germany, e.g. a concentration camp? Well, this is kind of what I was thinking of when I stood in that pit, in this kind of, it made me think of a Nazi train, to be honest. It felt like being hemmed in a kind of a regulated space, something that was efficient but ghastly. And I didn't really want to ask him about this, but this was my own personal, this is what I thought at the time. This is a hellish claustrophobic space. And even on, perhaps it might have been on an unconscious level, but I think this resonated for him. But yes, so I would agree with that, Leslie, absolutely.
Yeah, because I wonder when they decided to bring the metal in, because obviously it was initially called 100,000 newspapers and was about the tearing and the cutting up and the choosing and the selecting of newspapers and then tossing those. But where the contrast with the metal is so huge, isn't it?
But the metal was there. I think that was part of the fabric.
I see.
I'm virtually certain that, so going back to what you, the other audience member was asking about the use of found object. I mean, I think it was the entire room that was there. I think I'm virtually certain that everything you see apart from the newspapers was already there. And I think very little was done to it, but I could be wrong. But that was my impression. It felt like it was the fabric of the room that he was exploiting, that he was working with.
I just noticed Sylvia Finzi has also said, I think there was also a small version of 100,000 newspapers at Cubit in Islington, but much less powerful.
Oh, that's fascinating. Well, Sylvia, if you have any information about that, I'd be very interested to hear it or see it. I didn't know that. That's really, really interesting. I'd be interested to know how it differed from the original one, you know, given the use of the space and so on. Very interesting.
I wonder if anyone has any other questions which they would like to type into the chat. Just while we have a few minutes left. If not, is there anything else you'd like to say, Martin, before I
saw Bob putting his hand up, but I don't know if that was to ask a question or.
Bob, could you please type into the chat? I think that'd be easier if you don't mind. Was there anything else you wanted to say, Martin?
Oh, sorry, I beg your pardon.
We're waiting for.
It was really the experience of being in the room. It was quite shocking in its own way, and to have something that seems so conceptual, to have such a visceral, emotional impact, was unexpected and very powerful. And I'm sure it was intentional, but the fact that he didn't make direct mention of it is perhaps significant. No, it was very, very powerful, and it's hard to. That's why I wanted to go and stand in the pit, just to give us a sense of the experience, because standing on the platform, you didn't get such an appreciation of it. I felt I had to kind of almost get inside it, walk around it, you know, to document it properly.
It actually wasn't clear from the film even that you could actually physically go down into the pit there.
Oh yeah, there was a kind of a little walkway. You see Metzger sort of standing behind a set of shelves, freestanding shelves, throwing papers in. Well, where he's standing, I think, was a little walkway, and you could follow that right round the room and come back again. But then below that, I think that you could step onto the cellar floor, and it was very deep. So yeah,
it's also worth mentioning at this point and discussing the Nazi experience that this is something that is featured in our exhibition at Ben Uri. There's a particular self-portrait that I'm thinking of, where it is actually titled in German, and the title is translated as Self-Portrait and Undefiled, and it was painted in 1946, presumably, and it's thought to have been painted in Bomberg's classes, which Metzger famously attended in the 40s and 50s. And that is a very haunting image of a kind of skeletal figure in the moonlight.
I would be interested to know how the other people feel about this, because he's talking quite conceptually about a series of topics that relate to news and our experience of news and the transience of the materials and so on, and interfering with recutting news items. But at the same time, under that, there seemed to be this latent horror or something like that, an eeriness, which he doesn't refer to. And I wonder, in terms of his other work, how much of that is there? Talking about something on the surface, but underneath there's this, a kind of horror below the waterline, something like that. Because I felt that, but I wondered how, whether that was my own impression and it was accidental, or whether that was intended by Gustav.
I'm just going to read out two more comments before I wrap up this evening, as it's just after 7 o'clock now. But we can carry on all evening, but I'm not sure.
No, sure.
So H. Nyman, or Neiman, I'm sure if I'm pronouncing that wrongly, has said he kept a huge piles of newspapers at home to the dismay of his landladies.
Well, that goes back to an earlier question about how much of this did he keep at home. So H. Nyman, thank you very much. Then that clears that up. A lot of this could come from home. Maybe that's where he kept it in the meantime. Maybe that's where it went at the end of the exhibition, because he wanted to keep it for something subsequent. That's really, really interesting. That shows a kind of if I may say, a naughtiness about the man.
And then one, sorry.
No.
One final comment from Bob in relation to what we were discussing a little earlier. He says, it's difficult to put into words. Malevich started this idea of the integrity of the object on its own. In his stance as a human being, Gustav deliberately lived out this sense of humility and not only let the object speak for itself, but to include his own persona, to extend this to himself beyond the object, himself as the object.
I like what you say about letting the object speak for itself. So that would suggest that he chose that space with a reason, and that space in its new context did have an inherent sense of horror. I like that very much. And what was the rest of the question? Sorry, the observation of Bob's, Nicola?
Himself as the object.
I can't say very much about that. The fact that he had no airs and graces that I could see. He just got on with it. He was someone you might miss really well where he was setting up. I don't quite know what to say, but I don't quite know how to respond to that, Bob, I'm afraid. But
I think
sounds right.
Perhaps we'll have to leave it there for the questions. Okay. But thank you so much, Martin, for a wonderful talk and fascinating film. And also to our colleague Charlotte for the smooth running of the technical side. And to you, our virtual audience. If you would like to hear the whole of this stimulating evening again, please do look out for the recording of this event, which will be released shortly. Next week's event takes place on the 28th of July, next Wednesday, between 6 and 7:30 p.m. And during which a distinguished international panel will explore the themes of ecology and activism in Metzger, followed by an audience Q&A. And on that evening, we'll be welcoming Pontus Kajander, lecturer at the Finnish Academy of Fine Art and curator of Gustav Metzger, Act or Perish at the Center of Contemporary Art, Turin in 2015. Matthew Copeland, independent curator and author of Gustav Metzger Writings, 1953 to 2016. And Daniela Perez, curator of We Must Become Idealists or Die at Museo UMEX in Mexico, 2015. We also look forward to welcoming you, as many of you as possible, to our physical gallery in St. John's Wood to view the exhibition, which is currently on view until September. You can pre-book tickets via our website, benuri.org. And also please note that we have online iterations of the show. And finally, we do have a catalogue, don't know if you can see that, which is being published to accompany the exhibition and events programme. And that is priced at £20, and we sell that in the gallery or also on our website. So thank you very much and good night. Stay safe.
Thanks, everyone. Thank you for inviting me.